Good morning, friends. I'm here with Steve Swartz, and we're doing something a little creative today. Steve has his own college admissions podcast called College Admissions Toolbox, and Steve reached out to me, sent me an email. Was familiar with our podcast, and he said, why don't we do a joint podcast? That way we can expose each of us to each other's audiences, and people are always looking for good resources. And I said, yeah, let's have a conversation first. So Steve and I jumped on a call and talked, got to know each other, and felt like we had good synergy, and that's what we're doing today. So I'm here with Steve Swartz, who is the founder of the College Admissions Toolbox podcast, and of course, I'm Mark Stucker, founder of Your College Bound Kid podcast. I co-host with Anika Madden, who couldn't be with us today.
Yeah, Mark, thank you so much for being open to this collaboration. I love your podcast, and I thought it could be a lot of fun for us to have a meeting of the minds, so to speak, and kind of talk around some of the issues that we're most interested in.
Yeah, and the thing that's nice about it is, I just love talking with other colleagues in the field. I mean, just the last 2 days, I just got back from a fly-in into the Coast Guard Academy with 42 college admissions counselors. Was a counselor fly-in, and it was great being at the Coast Guard Academy and learning about them and the cadets. But half the fun was these 42 counselors, and just talking with them and learning from them. So to me, it's a little bit of us, hearing from each other, learning from each other, and also we know podcast listeners love to learn. That's why they're listening to podcasts. So there's kind of sponges for knowledge. So why not introduce each of our audiences to another tool?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's fun. I know that we've both done a lot of interviews on our podcast over the years, and it's just amazing how much you learn and how much you grow and you get new ideas and hear the latest that's happening in the industry. And so I think that we both have unique takes on this topic for today that we'll be able to share with our audiences and kind of develop our own understandings as well.
Yeah, sounds great. And with no further ado, you want to transition to what we decided we talk about today, Steve? What do you think?
Yeah. Let's jump into it. So I thought that it'd be good for us we could share a little bit of our backgrounds and then jump into the topic of the hour, which as we've discussed, is extracurricular activities. So Mark, do you want to just share a little bit of your backstory and how you got into college admissions and counseling before we jump into the extracurriculars topic?
Yeah, so both my parents are educators. I'm fourth generation educator. I didn't grow up envisioning myself following in that path. Went to Michigan State University. I thought I was going on a path toward Christian ministry, really. So I went to Moody Bible Institute, Dallas Theological Seminary. Then I took a year off and I did college admissions while I was in Dallas. And when I did it, to be honest, Steve, it wasn't the best experience. Like, I was at an underfunded school, low resource, and the school actually closed when I was working there.
Oh, wow.
And so it was a little disillusioning experience. And I kind of put that on hold for 10 years. Started out, did Christian ministry. I found out that really wasn't my calling. Did outside business to business sales for 6 years. And then at this point, I'm living in Philadelphia and ended up, married now, a couple of young kids, enrolled our daughter at Quaker school, K through 12 school, and became an active volunteer. And next thing you know, they offered me an admissions job, and it's a boarding school. So I'm traveling all around the world recruiting. So I did that from 2001 to 2009. And then I partnered with one of the legendary counselors in the field, Susan Tree, and became an adjunct college counselor with her. So that's really where I learned what I know today. That was my foundation, the combination of doing boarding school admissions, which is probably about 97% similar to liberal arts admissions, and doing college counseling. So I'd recruit the kids and then I'd work with them on their college placement. And so 2009, I moved down to Atlanta, Georgia, took a job on the KIPP through college team as a full-time counselor with KIPP. And then I was helping a lot of families. And then a year later, a bunch of families said, listen, could you help my brother, my sister, my coworker, my sorority brother, sister, all that. So I launched School Match for You, which is the educational company that I work with. And I've done that since 2010. But then in 2018, I'm a podcast junkie. I consume them all the time. I'm driving, I'm listening, and I'm like, wow, they're just amazing. And there were a couple of college admissions podcasts that I liked at the time. Actually, interesting how, they're not around anymore, but but they were helpful at the time. And I can't remember how it all happened, but one of the families that I'd helped through the process, I placed a kid at boarding school and then placed their son at Davidson College, where I have a daughter at as well. We said, hey, why don't we do a podcast together? I'm sort of the college admissions expert and she's the parent. And we've been going strong. Every single Thursday at 6 a.m. we drop a new episode. Our episodes range between 60 to 80 minutes. And they always have 4 components to them. They always take a hot topic in the news, we grab a hot article, we discuss it. That's the first phase. And the second phase is a book that I wrote. I wrote a 691-page book called 171 Answers, and we go chapter by chapter through that book. It has 171 chapters to it. So, and then we also take a question from our audience that gets sent in all around the world. And then the last thing is our interview. So that's kind of our format.
That's a very cool format and a very cool journey. It sounds like you've really been invested in this industry for quite a while in a variety of different ways. And I love the structure of your podcast. I love how in depth you go. And I think it's very cool that it's you and a real mom just kind of talking through the real issues that families face.
Yeah, I'll say something funny about it too, because we used a podcast consultant actually to guide us in our launch, and he was fantastic. But one thing he said at first, he didn't like the fact that when we wrote our blurb, it was like a college expert and parents. Like, no, people don't want to hear that. They want to hear from two experts. And we're like, no, we don't think so. Like, we think the value of a parent that's just an average parent is kind of important. And I'll tell you, we get floods of emails from people that say, Anika, most of the people listening are moms, and they so identify with her because that's their world that they're in. So she really makes the podcast. I have the knowledge, but she's the one who makes it super interesting.
No, I think that's cool. I think it definitely makes it more real and relatable. And I think parents need that.
Yeah, I know how you feel about it, Steve, but it's actually one of the most rewarding ventures I've done. It's just something about giving free information. There are no barriers by geography, no barriers by culture, by gender, by race, by income. There's something about it that's just pure and free that's just incredibly fulfilling.
It's a lot of fun, and it's kind of like you never really know who it's going to reach, and you might see it in the analytics that someone halfway around the world is listening, but you also get the emails too, and then they kind of make it more come to life because, as you know, like we're just kind of recording. We're not necessarily doing most of these live, and we're recording it and then sending it out, and then it can kind of go anywhere. It can take any direction. You never know who it's going to impact exactly, but hearing back some of those stories is definitely really rewarding.
Yeah, I really don't think people have any idea how much they encourage you when they just shoot you a little email and say, what you said on this, it helped me. Like, it's one thing to look at your podcast numbers going up and up and up, and that's encouraging, but it's just not the same. That's still very, very abstract, right? There's nothing like those tangible, real stories that really move you. But I've talked about myself a lot. Let's talk a little bit about you.
Yeah, sure. Thanks for that. So I've been college counseling for over 10 years now. And my journey kind of started back when I was applying to college. I really wanted to go to Columbia University. It was my top choice, but my grades and SAT scores didn't really measure up. But I was lucky in that I had developed a pretty incredible, unique extracurricular activity that I believe is what got me into Columbia. And that's what I heard from the admission officer who read my file. Basically, the summer before my senior year of high school, I ended up going to a United Nations conference in Johannesburg, South Africa, to lobby government delegates on the topic of sustainable development. And
Nice.
you might wonder, how did a high school student end up halfway around the world? That became my college essay. My letters of recommendation were written by government delegates. I ended up being on CNN. And so it was this really incredible, unique experience. And my guess is that the admission officers were wondering, like, how on earth did he end up there? And I didn't plan to do it. I didn't design this. It all happened as a series of happy accidents along the way. But I did end up with that admission offer from Columbia, and that's where I ended up going to college. And once I got in, I started helping out friends from high school who were a grade or two below me, helping them with their extracurriculars, helping them with their applications. And that's where this all kind of grew out of. I ended up doing a lot of college counseling throughout my time in undergrad at Columbia. And then when I finished and graduated, it was just the clear, natural next step for me. I started the Get Into College blog back in 2009, I believe, soon after graduating. And I ran that for over 10 years, just posting articles on every aspect of the college admissions process. It was at getintocollegeblog.com. But more recently, a few years ago, like yourself, I launched a podcast. I launched it, I believe it was in 2015 or 2016. I launched it. And I conducted a series of interviews with former and current admission officers, as well as a variety of college counselors all over the country. And I conducted 50 interviews like that. Each one was about 30 to 60 minutes. And then more recently, I've modified the format a bit to be shorter, bite-sized episodes of just typically 2 to 5 minutes. I release them every single week. And I'm starting to do more collaborations like what we're doing right now. And so those will be on the podcast as well. But I found that having a mix of the interviews and the shorter bite-sized ones really works well for families who are on the go. And I've since, of course, absorbed the Get Into College blog into the College Admissions Toolbox website. But one separate thing I have going on that's a lot of fun is also I created and moderate Reddit's college admissions forum at reddit.com/r/applying to college. And that's a bit more for the students and than the parents. So any parents listening out there, I would definitely have some caution stepping in because it can be pretty crazy in there sometimes. But that community has grown like wildfire. I started it, I think, about 5 or 6 years ago, and it's now grown to have nearly 100,000 members. So it's a very active community. I've brought on a team of moderators to help because the day to day is just way too much for me. I wouldn't be able to do anything else really, given how high schoolers can act online sometimes. But it's been a great place to hear from students and families and help them out a bit here and there. And it's a lot of fun. All of this has been a lot of fun. I'd say the podcast and the counseling are definitely my two biggest focuses these days. But it's been an incredible journey and it's been a lot of fun. And I'm excited to get into
No,
talking extracurriculars with you.
yeah, there are a number of things that jumped out to me about your story that I think are really compelling. I think they're really important for our listeners to hear. One of them is your situation was organic. Like it's not like you sat back and just sort of tried to game the system, right? You were like doing what you love. You're doing what you were passionate about. Or you wouldn't have done all those things if you really didn't care. And I think that's really, really, really important. And I do want to read one thing because this is a quote that I have this quote in my book. I love this quote, but I think it speaks to what one of the things that's important when it comes to college admissions. And it's a quote by Robin Mamlet, who's a former dean of admissions at Stanford, Swarthmore, Lawrenceville boarding school. She's worked at a lot of places. She was at Sarah Lawrence, Occidental. She's kind of worked in a lot of admissions offices, but this is what she says. She says, even more impressive than test scores or great transcripts or fantastic essays, colleges are looking for authenticity, not the appearance of authenticity, not the packaging of authenticity, not the strategy of authenticity, just authenticity, plain and simple. So why is that? If they detect exaggeration or pretense or packaging, how do they know which parts of the application are real? I just kind of love that quote. And I think what's one of the things that stood out about your extracurricular profile is it felt very organic. It felt very real. It didn't feel contrived. And I think another thing is that, if a student can sort of weave a theme throughout their whole application, it does make a very, very strong impression. And so you sort of had this consistent theme, right? From essays to recommendations to extracurriculars. And when college admissions officers are reading a file, they're trying to assess lots of things. Obviously, they're trying to assess, can the student do our program? What kind of citizen are they going to be? But one of them is, where will the student have impact on our campus? And what's the best way to do it? What you did in the past it's like that investment statement, right? Past performance is no guarantee of future results, but it's the best thing to have to go on. And so I think, as an admissions officer, if I'm reading the file that you told me, I'm going to expect a lot of impact in those areas. And the other thing is, college admissions officers are looking for interesting people who are unique and different. And I think people don't realize how much when you're interesting and unique, you add to the community and you stand out. So those are just some of my thoughts about what you shared. And anything you want to say on that, Steve?
No, thanks for that, Mark. I think it is something about it being unique. And it's kind of funny. I ended up being featured in a book by Cal Newport called How to Be a High School Superstar. He featured me as one of his examples of students who had unique, compelling extracurriculars. And he kind of generalized this sort of student, of which there aren't that many, of course, but under a general framework of what he called the failed simulation effect, meaning that you can't possibly imagine how a student would end up at that particular endpoint. Because of course, every high school has an editor-in-chief of the school newspaper. Every high school has a president of a club or the captain of a team. And those are great activities. And of course, they demonstrate leadership and commitment and dedication and all that wonderful stuff. But the mission officers are seeing hundreds and hundreds of students with those exact same positions. But something like going to this UN conference, and there were a handful of other students there, but most of them were college students, not high school students. And so it definitely stood out, I think, for that reason. And once again, I didn't get there by design. It was organic, as you said, and it happened through this series of happy accidents where I was applying for an internship at a nonprofit and they didn't have an opening, but they offered me a chance to go to some other UN conference. And then I leveraged that to go to get into future opportunities. But it happened bit by bit, but it was really just from me being curious and exploring in the outside world. And I think the point that Cal Newport drew out from my story was that I went outside the school environment. And
Yeah,
that's where
that's
there were
important.
more unique opportunities available that other high school students weren't even aware of. So it's like this hidden game.
No, I completely agree with that. And it's funny, I was just thinking of um, a, a mission officer. I was listening to her speak in front of a group of other counselors. I'm not going to say the name of the school or the name of the person, but it was a highly selective school. Everybody would kind of know this name. And she was saying, she's like, I'm going to scream if I read another application from an Eagle Scout this year. And she's and everybody in the office, she's like, that's so cruel. And she said, I'm sorry, this is how I feel. And I feel bad because having worked with people to become Eagle Scouts, I know how much work is involved in that, right? And it's really noble objective, and it's a great experience. And I support it and commend it 100%. But I bring it up because I think students feel a lot of times like when they do something like that, or as you said, editor, student body president, we could go on and on and on, that you're going to be a standout. And if we're talking about highly competitive admissions, look, 40,000 high schools in this country, 80,000 valedictorians and salutatorians, there's a lot of people with those things. So yeah, going outside is a great way. And, my question for you is, how can we help students strike the balance between knowing sort of going outside and doing something unique and creative can be very effective, but yet at the same time, we don't want it to be contrived?
That's a great question, Mark. And I think it ultimately does have to stem from the student's own interest and a particular topic that they may be especially passionate about. I worked with a student this past cycle who ended up partnering with her opera instructor, her opera teacher, to create a nonprofit to fund music, some sort of orchestra music program in Africa, in the Congo. And it was because she was interested in music, but she was also creating something new. And obviously, that's a very big, large endeavor for a student to do on their own. But in partnership with a teacher or an advisor, it can become a reality. But I think it does. That's one option to make it more manageable. But in terms of the interest itself, it has to come from the student. This can't be a parent pushing the kid to go create something because it's too big a project to go solely on others pushing you. You have to seek it out for yourself.
Yeah, there's no doubt when you do these things on a large, these really significant outside the box things, they can make you stand out. A lot of our listeners may be familiar with David Hogg, who became, very involved in student activism because of what happened in South Florida at Parkland. And, all his records and everything were public, but, at 4.2 GPA, 1270 SAT, he didn't get in, UCLA, UC Irvine, UC Santa Barbara, and one of the other UC schools he didn't get in. But, he got in Harvard. And there's no question his student activism and the role he's played, he's been all over TV everywhere. That's something that, is value. Now, obviously, that's not something that somebody can replicate, but that's just an example of how an extracurricular, if it is very distinct and significant in its impact, it can make a difference. I was talking to another admission officer recently at a really highly competitive school, and I asked them, what does it take to get your merit scholarship? Because I've had quite a few people get in your school, but they're not getting your merit scholarship. And then he said, well, we look for people that have done things like they've been the student manager of he said Stacey Abrams, national campaign manager as a student, and you've done everything. Like those are the kind of things that differentiate who gets that. because it's already a competitive school just for admission.
Yeah, well, I think it certainly does require a degree of drive. And it looks like, well, the funny thing about that student is it sounds like he really kind of made lemons out of lemonade. Like
Right.
not every student who goes through a traumatic experience can grow from it, right?
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. But there was also some other things too, which is who can really emerge as the number one national spokesperson on the topic. Like, it's not the easiest thing to do. And I know he wasn't thinking of, oh, this will help me with my college application, right? It was sort of the organic aspect of it. And I brought it up as an example. Like, yeah, there's no doubt ECs can be a definitive reason why people get in. And besides just like recruited athletes and recruited artists and things like that, right? But I think it's hard. I feel like it's pretty hard actually at the most selective schools for me to sort of shape that, because I think a couple things are factors. One, there's the aspect of it being authentic and organic, which is really important. Like, I had a mom say to me recently, "You're not going to tell my daughter to join a club to get into college, or to start a club to get into college, are you?" And I actually respected that. And there was actually a time earlier in my day when I used to do that, but I'm really into authenticity now. And so now that doesn't mean never, because if I feel the kid really wants to do it, that's sort of my thing, right? If the kid really, really wants to do it. But the challenge I find with this, Steve, is that most people come to me in 11th grade. Like, sure, some start in 10th. You start trying to chart out some extracurricular resume in 11th grade, doesn't really work. And so that's between it not looking authentic and you starting too late. It can work to me, but it doesn't tend to work at the most selective schools unless the student was already really on that path already on their own. Those are my thoughts. I don't know what you think.
That makes a lot of sense. I think that ultimately you want the child to have some kind of pattern of interest in something. And of course, a child can develop new interests, but I
Right.
think most children don't go from having 0 interests to having 100 interests, right?
Yes.
That looks kind of forced and artificial, I think, where it looks like they hired a college counselor right in the spring of junior year. And then
Yes.
obviously they said, well, we have to do everything all at once, but obviously that's not going to fly.
Yeah, I actually had a college counselor on my podcast. We were talking about this, and he almost felt if a student's going to add an extracurricular, now he said going into 12th, he said I'd almost rather they not even do it. Like, that's how bad I think it looks. It's so smacks of resume building for the sake trying to get in. It's just such a turn off to our office. So finding that balance is challenging between one, being authentic, two, coming from them. And at the most selective schools, you already have to have all the numbers just to even get to the academic aspect of the process. And then I find that people are already, because it tends to be a very, very affluent population, and the more affluent the population, the more parents have already been exposing their kids to so much enrichment, that a lot of the kids in that pool already have decent ECs. So now I'm not trying to say that there's nothing that you and I can do. Like, that's not my point. I just think that I think it's rare for the person to be the way you were. Like, when you told me what your extracurriculars were, like, to me, you were in the 1% club on extracurriculars, being on CNN and what you did overseas and being written up in the book and all of that. And, that I would venture to guess that admission counselor, I definitely bet there's maybe 2 or 3 people in the whole year that he stopped and had a conversation with and said, your extracurriculars made a difference. That's some of my thoughts. I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, for my personal story, of course, there was an element of luck as well as
Yeah.
being open to opportunity. Luck was a big part of it, no doubt. But I think that my interests, this started early. I was going to a UN conference in 10th grade. And so
Right,
the
right,
one that
right.
was in South Africa, that was before senior year, like that was an outgrowth of something that had already started earlier through an element of luck. But I think
Yes.
that for in most situations when we have parents coming to us spring of junior year, looking
Yes.
ahead to the fall, what we have two options. Maybe we can take what the child already has at that point and
Yes.
work with it, or my recommendation would be to consider doing something perhaps small or is simply a natural outgrowth of what they've already been doing previously, whatever it might be.
Yeah. And that's where I think you're in the gray area where it's sometimes I agree, sometimes I don't. The way I come down is the student really want to do this? or is it something that they're going to do because they think it helps them get in college? That smacks of packaging, and it's just the stuff that makes admissions officers not like educational consultants.
Yeah.
So, but if I have a student that really has energy and really wants to do something, then I'm comfortable with it. So that's kind of my piece. To me, that's where the authenticity comes in.
But I think
Yes.
that for in most situations when we have parents coming to us spring of junior year, looking
Yes.
ahead to the fall, what we have two options. Maybe we can take what the child already has at that point and
Yes.
work with it, or my recommendation would be to consider doing something perhaps small or is simply a natural outgrowth of what they've already been doing previously, whatever it might be.
Yeah. And that's where I think you're in the gray area where it's sometimes I agree, sometimes I don't. The way I come down is the student really want to do this? Or is it something that they're going to do because they think it helps them get in college? That smacks of packaging, and it's just the stuff that makes admissions officers not like educational consultants.
Yeah.
So, but if I have a student that really has energy and really wants to do something, then I'm comfortable with it. So that's kind of my piece. To me, that's where the authenticity comes in. Now, there are some things that I think we can do other than having them start a club or do something. And to me, one of the things is making sure that what they're already. Does that make sense?
You broke up a little bit. We'll have to fix this
Okay.
part. You said
Okay.
you said making sure, and then it got lost.
Yeah, making sure that what they're already doing is being presented in its most favorable light.
That
You
is the
know?
key. That is, I think, that last part you said. That I mean, all of it resonated, but I think
Yeah,
it has to be authentic. I think is key,
yeah,
and having it be a continuation of what they're already doing, but maybe just going bigger with it. Maybe a
yes,
hobby or interest, creating something out of that. It could be an event, it could be an organization, it could be an internship, but you at least you have that trend line all the way from the beginning.
yeah, and it can even be things even more subtle than that. It can be having your outside recommendation writer be a person in your file that writes about that, what you're doing, so that the impression is really really substantial when it comes across the application. It can be using the additional information section in the Common App to describe in more detail than the 150 characters that you get, which is so limiting anyway. So you can present a much fuller picture. So those are the kind of things that I think can be done. And the place I find it can really make the biggest difference are schools that do holistic admissions. Obviously, if you're just crunching numbers and doing admissions by the numbers, you're not even looking at essays or recs or any of that stuff, right? Which is a lot of schools. So if you're holistic, but you're not the most selective, because when you're the most selective, the bar for the EC, I mean, the bar for everything is so high, right? For grades, for scores, for curriculum, for essays, for recommendations is so high that it's just harder to stand out. But that doesn't mean that it doesn't make a difference. When I was doing boarding school admission, and we would this time of the year when we would have conversations with with schools about who they're going to take and counselor calls, they would routinely refer to people by their EC. I mean, that was common. Let's talk about the drummer. Let's talk about the soloist. What are our chances? Are we in play? That's oftentimes what the way the framework through how they would see the kids was through the prism of how are they going to impact our community extracurricularly.
I think that makes a lot of sense though, because the numbers aren't human. Look the same for everybody. The numbers make it a commodity game, and so
Correct.
that may happen in some cases, of course. And obviously, perfect scores make a big difference. But I think that for most applicants, the ECs are the one thing they can change late in the game if they craft it carefully based on an outgrowth of what they're already doing authentically. But beyond that, it's also the most human element. And yeah, it's natural. It would stand out because it shows the applicant's potential in a way I think that numbers don't. It shows where they might end up, what might their career look like. Obviously, it may not be in that particular niche or that particular topic, but the type of work they do. And of course, as we were discussing earlier, like how they deal with failure, how they grow from that, right? What they do
Right.
next.
Yeah, the only thing that I would disagree with you a little bit on, I think essays are the easiest thing to change late in the game to have the most profound impact. Because literally, I can start with somebody in January. Well, let's say January's late, but let's say November of the senior year, and the essay could, because the student's own voice is very powerful. And that is the one thing that there doesn't have to be a track record of something they've done at all, where I just find there's a lot more scrutiny. I, I felt this when I did admissions and when I talked to admissions officers. Admissions officers' antenna is sky high for somebody who's doing something for the purpose of resume building, and they can sniff it. They can absolutely sniff it, and it's not that easy to. It's pretty easy for somebody to be exposed, and so I think overall the essays are the easiest way, really late in the game, to have that influence. Now, the strongest applicants will have both, right? Like you need to be bringing something to the table and something to the community. So ideally, you do both.
Correct. No, I should have been a little more clear in how I framed that. I think that obviously we're talking November, right before deadlines. Yes, the essays, and obviously if someone hasn't done any prep, the essays. But talking now in the spring, I think there is enough time to do something with the ECs,
Yes.
probably over the summer, even into the fall of senior year. But yes, last minute, the essays are the big thing. And that's honestly what most families end up coming to me for, and probably you as well, I would imagine.
What would you say? Most people come to us for what?
For the essays towards the end.
Yeah, I think for me, people come to me for lots of things. Building the list is extremely important to them. You know, definitely building the list and overall strategies, right? Admission strategies. They just don't know all kinds of things. Strategies around tests, strategies around essays, strategies around visiting schools, strategies around communication with schools. You know, really all aspects of it, and then all the questions they have. People that need money, financial strategies, scholarship strategies. So I think all of that, it's sort of a little bit of everything. At least for me, and maybe our clients are different. I don't know.
Yeah, it could be. I'd imagine that I tend to get more people interested in talking about ECs and essays just because that's what I focus on. That's my story too. So I think
Yes.
it does relate to that. And obviously
Yeah,
being in
yeah,
the
because
book and
people probably
everything.
have heard your story,
Yeah.
and maybe they're wondering, can you help me, you know, to chart a path similar to what worked for you, and that can work. It's a lot better if it's the student doing it, not the parent, and that tends a lot of times to be the parent. But sometimes it's a parent that sees a passion that their kid has, right, and that's when it can work.
Yeah, I think so. I think honestly we have to have everybody on board with whatever the plan is going to be. So there's a bit of negotiating between all parties, I think.
Yeah, like I have a student going to Yale this year, and one of the things I think that really was helpful for her was the research that she did on breast cancer. And she did it between summer of 10th and 11th, and then again between 9th and 10th, and then between 10th and 11th. And it was really high level research. But the whole thing, it was consistent with the whole family story, because there had been breast cancer in the family, significantly in the family, mom, grandma, multiple other people. So now the whole thing fit together, right? I see the passion, I see how it impacted you personally, I see what you're doing about it. But this is all stuff that she really, really wanted to do. And obviously she had like incredible grades and scores and curriculum and everything like that. But there's no question in my mind that research was a help for her, because I mean, what Yale's like. They're turning down plenty of people with perfect scores.
And that's where, again, it comes down to the idea that the numbers at a certain point, it has to be something aside from the numbers. And I think your anecdote about them referring to people as the soloist or the violinist or something like that, there's something human that admission officers see in the person. They're not admitting an application, they're admitting a human being. And
Definitely.
the ECs and the essays and the rec letters and all those other quote unquote soft factors, I think they can make a bigger difference sometimes.
No, no question. Because and this is something that the average person doesn't understand, because they tend to say stuff like, "I don't get it." Like, I got a, let's say it's a highly selective school, and they might say something like, "You're not going to believe this, Mark, but there's a student in our school, and they got like 1590 on their SAT, and they didn't get in XYZ school, and this other person got like 1420, and they got in." Or whatever, right? And that doesn't compute in their mind. They think, and they don't understand that the way I explain it to my students and families is the testing is almost like a pass fail. Once you get in range, you're fine. And I interviewed Rick Clark from Georgia Tech on our podcast, and he's like, we don't even hardly even discuss it. It's all their middle 50% is 1450 to 1550. They rarely see somebody that doesn't have good scores, so it doesn't differentiate at all, and it hardly ever comes up in the conversation at all. It's like, it's just like, glance at it. Now, mind you, if they were seeing 960, 1050s, 830s, you know what I mean, 12, yeah, I'm not trying to say scores and curriculum and grades and things are not cutoffs, because they absolutely are. But at the most highly selective schools, I heard Yale say recently that you literally almost could take their denial pool and replace it with their admit pool, and you almost wouldn't notice a difference.
That's how strong it is on numbers.
Yeah, that's how strong it is on,
and everything else too, potentially, there, because there's such a small pool, the pool they can take.
Yeah. Just the whole academic profile, right?
Yeah,
From GPA to test scores to SAT, ACT to AP to subject tests to courses taken. They all look really strong, and so then it becomes, okay, what are these other factors?
Yeah, then it becomes this idea of diminishing marginal returns with additional time devoted to test prep. If you're already getting a 1450 or a 1460, why spend another year struggling to get a 1550, and instead maybe explore your other legitimate, authentic interests and build something interesting out of it.
And not only that, but even if you struggle to get that 1550, I mean, I have a lot of students that, that I work with this year that have those really high scores that they didn't get in a lot of schools. Like, they got in other amazing schools, but that is I mean, if you look at the average score profile at the most selective school, their denials are ridiculous. It's ridiculous. So not only would it maybe be hard to struggle to pull yourself up that extra 100, it actually wouldn't really increase your chances of admission that much at the most select. I'm talking about the most selectives, right? Like, you go down a level and the scores can make a huge difference.
Well, I think the top schools like Yale, they don't need to worry about their rankings with that the slight differences in SAT scores. Maybe lower ranked schools might care about something like that.
Yeah, and it's not even about the ranking. It's just that someone just stands out more in their applicant pool because they just don't see as many people like them. You know what I mean? So at every level, right? If they're just assessing it not from a ranking standpoint, but just, let's say their goal is, as Deb Shaver, former dean of admission, I interviewed her from Smith on, and she said, my goal first and foremost is to keep my faculty happy. I got to keep my faculty happy. So they want, intellectually engaged, critical thinkers who are interesting. So even if you're not even looking at ranking, you're just looking at, I want to deliver, I want to increase the intellectual fiber of our community, keep the faculty happy. At the less selective level, you can stand out more just off of the pure academic stuff.
And there are also just the idiosyncrasies of what they're looking for in that year's class and who they don't have yet. What kind of person are they lacking that they would like to fill? So there's a certain degree of randomness to it based on who else has been applying that year.
Oh, there's huge degrees of randomness to it.
Like, do they have, maybe they want a trombonist and they don't have one yet. No, look, you come along, you play the trombone, great, you're in, as long as you meet up the criteria.
Yeah, I mean, recently heard Princeton's dean of admissions say this exact thing. Like, they got to the end of their class and they realized that, oh, gee, we don't have enough brass, and they're hearing from the orchestra conductor, we're not going to be able to play certain pieces.
Yeah.
So they went back and looked at their pool and they plucked off some really talented people. And so there's the randomness of what they need in any given year. And that can be lots of things, not just extracurriculars. That can be a major. That can be, you know what, we're going to maybe cancel German unless we have more people apply, or our linguistics department is in danger of surviving. So that can be an undersubscribed major. That can be all kinds of things. And then there's institutional priorities, which is huge, right? You look at these people that work at the religious schools. Almost always, I've seen it. I was at a Quaker school, and yeah, we were on the lookout for Quakers, and not that many around. And so, even if that means we're at 10 or 12%, that was a big deal. Same for Jesuit schools. And anyone I've ever known that's worked at a Jesuit school, that was a bit of a priority. And so you've got your institutional priorities, then you've got the randomness of who's reading your file, which is a huge factor.
Yeah, so I guess
Yeah.
the message that there's a couple things that come to mind here. I mean, of course, there's the message that there is an element of randomness where if you get rejected, it may just be that you didn't have the trombone and someone else did, or you were in a
Hmm.
Quaker and someone else was, and that alone could have an
Yep.
impact. But then the
Yes.
other thing I'm thinking about is just how funny it is, the American system that we have, how strange it looks to folks from other countries where they're saying, what do you mean the person with the 1450 gets in
I know.
over the 1550? It just is incomprehensible to them in other countries where they think we're very soft for being so holistic when the numbers to them don't lie.
Yeah, I agree. So many other countries just go by the numbers, but I think our system is infinitely better, because I think it's much more akin to, like, if you had a company and you needed to hire people, you're really looking at all aspects. So you're looking at what are our institutional needs right now. You're looking at what is your personality, what are your interests, are you interesting? Then the whole ethical, moral piece, all that. Can you do the job, of course, but you're looking at how you fit into the whole. Like you're looking at the community. And I think that that's important, because you're bringing somebody into a community. It's not an individual person. So what piece of the puzzle they fit in making the community what it is important to making that community the type of community that you want to have. So I love how the American system is holistic. I hate it when schools just crunch numbers, and like so many of especially less selective schools do, and a lot of big state schools do. I hate that, because people are so much more than a number.
I love it too. And it's the funniest thing. This American system, we have it, it works. And I think we're seeing that more than ever now with the rise of tech and startup culture and STEM, because there's this idea that, in other countries where they're afraid of failure, they're afraid of being entrepreneurial, they're afraid of trying things where they don't know what's going to happen and experimenting. And obviously Americans are all about the experimentation and going to the frontier and the can-do spirit. And we'll try to figure it out even if it doesn't work the first time. And it's funny, I work with a lot of STEM kids who are doing like startup type things or tech and entrepreneurialism and entrepreneurship, excuse me. And I had this one applicant this past cycle who applying to MIT got in, and he couldn't stand academics. He couldn't stand the schoolwork and the busy work and the assignments, but he was obsessed with robots. Like he wasn't goofing around on the side in the afternoons and weekends. His parents couldn't pull him away from the robot club and the robot competitions. And that's what he was doing. And standardized test numbers wouldn't have reflected that because his math was high,
Right.
but obviously his verbal wasn't, that wasn't his thing. He didn't care. He wouldn't
Yeah.
devote a single iota of effort to it. And maybe he should have, of course, but his passions lie elsewhere.
Yeah, and I'm sure that came to his application.
Yeah.
And and that probably was what differentiated him. I do find at the highest levels, doing an exceptional EC that's distinctive can absolutely make a difference. There's no question. I mean, I was just with a friend of mine who's a former rep from Vanderbilt last week, and I was talking about, let's do a deep dive. Like, who gets the Cornelius Vanderbilt? Who gets the Ingram? Who gets the Chancellor? Like, those are three of their merit scholarships. And because, I mean, Vanderbilt's tough getting in Vanderbilt these days if you're not 35, 35 or 36 ACT or 1500s plus. They're very, very score conscious, and their pool is so strong. And what did she say? Oh, that's the kid who did this ridiculous thing in another country, like when they were like 14 or something. Like when you're competing for those. I mean, obviously, when you're applying a highly selective school and then you're trying to get a substantial cost of attendance scholarship, you know what the pool is like, right? It's ridiculous. And there's almost nothing you can just do up pure academics. I mean, I suppose if you were the Einstein, then but it's just so hard to do that. Like how many kids are like that?
No, it's true. It's true. I think that it's just gotten tougher than ever. The numbers they keep rising.
Yeah, and it's funny because we're recording this just after regular decisions came out, and I do a lot of collaboration with. I have a lot of kids in boarding school because I did boarding school admissions for a long time, so I have a lot of kids. I'll place them in boarding school, and then I'll work with them on their college piece. And so, in doing that, boarding school college counselors, they're some of the best. They've come from great institutions, and I collaborate with them. And so, I had multiple conversations with boarding school college counselors um, this week after the regular decisions came out, and it was like, wow. Um, it was like it's just really getting tougher and tougher and tougher. And I know myself, I'm doing a lot more work to expectation set with families because it's very hard for parents to realize how much certain schools have changed from their era. I mean, I've seen it. There's schools to me that literally would take almost every kid, from when I was doing boarding school college counseling, take every B minus kid. And now they're being nitpicky and saying, well, this kid didn't take 4 years of Spanish. They only took 3, and they have everything else that's amazing. And they're booting them out. it's so yeah. So we got to recalibrate. And the good news is there are amazing other schools out there. It's just trying to get people to realize that some of these other schools truly are amazing.
Well, exactly. Yeah, it's about not being too married to one particular school. And then one thing that's coming to mind for me, which is what I always tell families is, if the numbers aren't doing it for you, like the test scores aren't getting you where you want to go, you could redirect elsewhere.
Yeah.
Because I think at a certain point for many kids, they just can't compete on the numbers. There's too much competition on these standardized tests.
Yeah. And the hard part with testing is testing knocks you up, but doesn't get you in.
Mm-hmm.
So if you don't have the testing, really the whole academic profile.
Right. Even if you got the number, you might still not get in.
Yeah. Yeah. So it doesn't get you in, but it will knock you out.
Yeah.
And now of course there's always caveats even with that too, right? If you're like a star football or basketball player, you don't really need the numbers.
Right.
I remember this was some time ago, but I had SAT scores for every single football program in the country.
Oh wow.
And yeah, and so you would see a school like a Notre Dame. And Notre Dame was actually one of the higher ones, and the average was an 898 on the team, for who they admitted. And compared to an average typical student in the mid to 1400s. And so, yeah, there were quite a few schools that were. So, so if you're bringing money into the institution, you're a big money maker, then there's some different standards.
Yeah,
but we're not talking about that.
Yeah, that's what we were talking about earlier, like institutional priorities, right? It does come back to that. The football player is like the trombonist, but only more so.
Much more so.
Yeah.
I know when I visited University of Georgia for the first time, they're like the first students that get priority over anything when it comes to course selection are the football players. Never heard anybody say that to me before. This is like right in the open state. Like this isn't a private one-on-one meeting. This is like the information session with everybody.
Yeah.
They're saying why, and it was mission director. He said, I know you're thinking why, because they bring us lots of money. That's what he said. I mean, if you're paying your coach $5 to $7 million, how much money are you bringing into the institution?
You're the highest paid person in the university, right?
Yeah, like 7 times the president a lot of times. Yeah, great. So what do you want? Do you want to wind down, Steve, or anything else you want to comment on? What do you think?
No, I think we pretty much hit it. This was awesome. This was a pleasure.
Yeah, I appreciate, I love to network, and the idea of sort of collaborating with somebody else doing the work is always fun, and hopefully our listeners enjoyed it, and hopefully, we challenged each other as well. So thanks for reaching out to me. I've enjoyed this.
Definitely. Before we sign off, do you want to just share with folks listening on my end the best way to get in touch with you and your book and your podcast and all that?
Yeah. And then you can do the same as well. So, so my website is schoolmatchforyou.com, and that's school, SCHOOL, match, MATCH, and it's the number 4 and the letter U.com. So I've got a lot of information up there, including direct links right to the podcast. And the podcast is yourcollegeboundkid.com. I'm sorry, Your College Bound Kid. We do have our own website, yourcollegeboundkid.com. We're on every major, wherever you listen to podcasts, wherever you listen to Steve, you can get us. So whether it's Spotify or iTunes or Apple or Stitcher or iHeartRadio or whatever, we're kind of Google. We're all over the place. So, and then I do have a book I wrote called 171 Answers. and it's a reference book. So it's a great tool, and we get great feedback from people that listen to that. And you could get that at 171answers.com, or it's also on Amazon.
Perfect. Well, I'll make sure to include links to all those in the show notes on my end for the description for this episode. And then for those listening on your end, again, my name is Steve Schwartz. I host the College Admissions Toolbox podcast. My website is collegeadmissionstoolbox.com. And the podcast you can find on Spotify, Google Play, iTunes, of course, and pretty much everywhere else.
Yeah, you know what I find too, Steve? People that listen to podcasts, they just have such a thirst for knowledge. They can't get enough of it. And so I'm sure a lot of our listeners will appreciate us introducing, another resource for them to check out.
Exactly.
So,
Everyone on my end can listen to your back catalog and vice versa.
yeah. Thanks again. And next time I'm in New York, I do get to New York because I'm on a board there called Go to College New York City, where we help some really gifted and talented but under-resourced kids get into college. And so I'm up there for board meetings a couple times a year. So next time I'm in New York, let's grab a coffee.
Excellent, man. Let's do it. Definitely.
Yeah. Thanks, Steve.
Thanks, Mark. Be well.